Hi and welcome to this session, Install and Configure your FileMaker Server. My name is Claus. I run a company called Dataminix. We are based in Denmark, Europe, and I've been a FileMaker developer since '94. Beside that, I have a degree in commercial photography. So this session is going to be really packed with a lot of information. So I encourage you to go on the internet and look at some of the other videos I've been doing, for example with Richard Carlton, where we dig into some of the topics that we touch on this session, but we go more in depth. So the agenda for this session is, as you see here, we are going to talk about the basics about the FileMaker Server, what is under the hood. We are going to talk about basic technologies around the server. So these stuff are basics, and maybe you already know them, but I don't think it hurts to get them refreshed. And if you're brand new to this, then it might provide some good information. Then we are going to talk about the installation on Mac, Windows and Linux. And throughout this session, I'm going to talk about what is best practice. Finally, we are going to talk about SSL and security, and we round up with the backup. So the FileMaker Server, what is the FileMaker Server? Well, it's a server that is hosting your database files, your FileMaker database files. It serves these files to the FileMaker clients on the desktop, FileMaker Pro, and on the iOS, the FileMaker Go. Beside that, you can access your files through WebDirect, through a web browser, if you develop for that. And then you can also share your data via the REST API. And now you can also share via the OData. Actually, John Renfrew has a great session about OData in this event, and I encourage you to go watch that if you have interest in knowing what the OData is all about. Then we also have the ODBC, and finally it's a server that takes care of your backup. So the components of FileMaker Server is roughly like I've put on this chart. So at the core we have the database engine. This is where the Draco engine sits. That is the secret source of the FileMaker platform. This is the engine that does the magic for the FileMaker. It serves directly to the FileMaker clients on FileMaker Go and FileMaker Pro. Then we have basically two components that is taking care of web serving. So the first is the web publishing engine, which was invented for FileMaker 6, if I recall correctly. In FileMaker 12, it saw a massive update when WebDirect was invented. It is responsible for serving to the PHP API and the XML API, which is now deprecated. You can still get them to work on Windows and Mac, but they are not available on the Linux. However, the WebDirect is also using the web publishing engine. Then we have the other component that is the Node.js, which is serving the data to the REST API and the OData API in the JSON format. For everything that goes to the web, there's a web server that is serving the content to the gateways that is shown on the right side. On Windows, we are using the IIS web server. On Mac, it is the Apache web server, and then on Linux, it has been the Apache web server for Ubuntu 18, but now with the newest release for Ubuntu 20, we are using the Nginx web server. You can get the Apache web server and use that for the Ubuntu 20 release, but by default it is using the Nginx. So this is roughly how the FileMaker Server is structured under the hood. Naturally, there's a lot more to it, but this is the overview. So let's talk a bit about the technologies around the server. So first we have the network address. This is the IP address. Every single computer or device that is on the internet, on the network, has an IP address. So basically, if you want to talk to a server, for example, your computer needs to know the address. And the address is an IP address. For example, like the one shown here, 192.68.140.125. You can have almost 4.3 billion addresses in this format, which was so many more computers than they ever thought would be on the internet. So the difference between IPv4 and v6 is that IPv4 is using a 32-bit and the IPv4 is using a 128-bit, which gives so many addresses that I'm not able to tell the number. So this is the address that is needed in order for a computer to speak to another computer. But we cannot remember an IP address. That is simply too hard to remember. So that's why a domain name was invented, a system for domain names. So instead of typing in the IP address, you type in the domain name like claris.com, and then your computer is asking a DNS server on the internet, what is the IP address for this domain name? And the DNS server will know the answer, or it will know how to ask other DNS server on the internet in order to find the address. And as soon as it has responded back to your computer, this is the IP address, then your computer can connect to the server's IP address. So the DNS is like the phone book of the internet. Now, when you know the address, typically you never go directly to a server. You go to the firewall or the router of the place where the server sits behind that. So in order to get into the server, we need to know which door we can get in through. And that is just like an apartment building where we need to know what door we can get in through. So for FileMaker Server, it is much easier nowadays. We only have port 5003 for FileMaker and 443, which is the HTTPS, so that is the web ports. So that is the ports, so you need to have those open in order to get in. Now in the router, there is a service called NAT, Network Address Translation. So when we get there and say, I want to get in through port number 5003 in order to get to a FileMaker, behind the router there can be several servers. So there needs to be something that can translate and say, okay, so you want to connect through 5003, and which server is serving content on port 5003? Hey, this is the server 1. So this is the network address translation that sits in your router. In your router, you also have a firewall, for sure. And the firewall is your security guard. This is making sure that no traffic will get through that is not authorized. So if there's any traffic going on to a different port for a different service that might be on the server, that should be blocked by the firewall. So this is really restricting it. Right, so this is the basics around the server. Now let's talk a little bit about volume best practice. So when you have the server, by default, everything goes onto the system drive. Now what happens if your server goes down with the system drive? Well, you lose all your content. Hopefully you have done some backups that is not on the system drive, so you can recreate. But if we should do the best practice, we should actually have 4 volumes or 4 disks, one for the system, And the system is being used, the system disk is being used quite a lot for the system. The operating system is using the system disk a lot, and the FileMaker server is also using the system disk a lot. So there's a lot going on that server disk. So have a disk for your databases, one for external container data, and then the last one for backups. Now, if your server crashes and burns, then the system goes away, but you still have your databases. On the database disk, you have the container and you have the backup. And if you're using a virtualized system or one of the cloud providers, you can always spin up a new server and just attach the 3 disks to your new server. So this is best practice. So security around the server best practice. You should really use strong passwords. And if you're running Linux, you should use a private key instead, because when you're logging into the server, that will be sent in clear text. So if you're using username and password to connect to your Linux server, that will be sent in clear text until the connection is established, then it's encrypted. But for Mac and Windows, you have passwords, and you need to use strong passwords. These connections are encrypted from the start, so it's not that bad to use password there. In fact, that's quite one of the only ways to do it. Then you should make sure that you limit your access to remote desktop protocol for Windows or Apple Remote Desktop on Mac and SSH ports. And when I say limit access, I mean that do not allow any computer on the internet to be able to connect through these ports, because you have full access to the server and you can do a lot of bad stuff there. So make sure you limit in the firewall so that only your IP address can connect to it. For example, do never connect to these when you sit on a coffee shop and you're not connected to your own network via a VPN. And always have the firewall on. Now, talking about strong passwords, this is how it looks in 2022. And the pattern here is that the longer, the better. So 18, the length of characters, 18 characters, and if you combine with numbers, upper and lowercase letters, and symbols, then it takes a lot of time to brute force the password. So make sure that these are really strong. So let's install and configure the FileMaker server. Okay. So when we install on Mac and Windows, the installer is basically taking care of everything. But after the install, you need to install the SSL and configure your server. And just as a side note, if you upgrade your server instance, then the new installer will preserve all your settings, which wasn't the case in the past. So this is a sped up video of the installation process on Windows. It's pretty much the same thing going on Macintosh. You are guided through the installer, and this is also where you are entering the information about your organization, and the license key is being picked up. As you can see, the license certificate is actually in the download folder here. You enter the username and password of the server administrator, and then there's a pin so you can use command line to reset the password. And then you need to restart the system. So here I'm just showing that you need to initialize and format the volumes and attach them to your system. This is how it's done on Windows. On Macintosh, they are typically a little bit easier, but as you can see now we have the data, the container, and the backup drive. So configuration, make sure that you always disable this setting to automatically open databases. If something crashes and something goes wrong, then you would not want to have FileMaker Server to do this all the time. Open your database, because it can corrupt your database. Only open the database files when you're sure that your server is running as it should. So also filter out so that you cannot see the database files when you do the open host on your FileMaker Pro clients. And make sure that you set up a email address and settings so you can get notifications from the server. For example, if someone is trying to open a file and types in the wrong password too many times. So this is basically the installation and basic configurations on Windows, and it's basically the same on Mac. So let's talk a little bit about installation on Linux. So first we need to mount volumes to a mounting point. This is something that I go into detail with in a video I did with Richard Carlson. So this is gonna go pretty fast. So go and look up that video if you want to know more details. So we mount that, and then we copy the assisted installed txt file, which is just to make it more handy installation on Linux, and then the license certificate as well, which is not really needed, but it just makes the installation a little bit more smooth. Then after you have fired up an instance of Linux, you should update it. Then we download the FileMaker Server installer, and then we install the FileMaker Server. And I have the commands here that I'm using in the video. First we install the library called unzip, so we can unzip the installation file that we download directly from Claris's download site. We unzip it, we do some cleanup, and then we install the FileMaker Server, and finally we end with a reboot. So first we install the unzip library, then we do the update and upgrade of the Linux installation. Now we make sure that we are in the right directory, and now we download the installer directly from Claris's website, and we do some cleanups. And now we do the installation of the FileMaker Server. This is sped up a little bit, so this happens pretty fast on the video. And now finally we end this process by doing a reboot, so we make sure that everything is started correctly and nicely. So what is an SSL certificate? Because that's the next topic here. So a person can claim to be anyone. However, if you have a passport, it verifies that the person is really who he say he is. This password is issued by someone we trust, or at least we should put trust in, which is the government, that vouch for the identity of a person. Now for a server, we have a SSL certificate. That is kind of a passport for servers. So a server can also claim to be anyone, but in order to verify it, we need the passport for the server, which is the SSL certificate. So the principles is that you purchase a SSL certificate from a certificate authority. When we install it, it gets installed for the FileMaker Server, the database engine, and then it gets installed for the web server as well, so that we can have encrypted SSL connections to both the native clients and the web clients. So the process is like this, where on the FileMaker server we create a certificate signing request, which is filling out a form, and then we end up with a base64 block that we can send to the certificate authority in order to purchase our custom certificate. When they have verified that we are who we say we are, and finally verify the custom certificate. So how does that look? Well, this is the signing of the certificate signing request. Fill out the form, and as you can see, we get a base64 encoded block here, begin and end certificate signing request. Now we have the signed one back, and then we have the intermediate certificate back. So let's go and get that imported into the server. So we select the signed certificate, which was on the desktop here. The private key, we do not upload that because that should be on the server. It is already on the server in the C store. This was created during the process of doing the certificate signing request, and it should never leave the server. So now we just choose the intermediate certificate and then enter the password that we input when we did the signing certificate. Right. So let's go to solution security, because that is also a very important thing of being secure. So use strong credentials, and credentials is passwords. So make sure that you have really good passwords. So privileges sets are key to security in FileMaker. Even though they can be a hassle to get your head around, spend some time learning more about the privileges set, because they are key to security in FileMaker. Policies are very important as well. So when should the key password be renewed? Should users log out? Where are they allowed to connect to the databases from, and so on. This is important, and also make sure that you do not have access to any users that are maybe a former employee of the company. Encryption at rest should be used. That is also a feature of the platform. Make sure that you set this on as well. Go into the manual and see how it's done. There's also several videos out there that shows that. You can also use field level encryption. So if you store, for example, social security numbers or other sensitive information into a field, it could be a good thing to encrypt that so it doesn't show up in plain text. So let's say you do a print, and by accident you maybe include the field for the social security number on that printout. If it's encrypted, then it doesn't fall in wrong hands. And you should also really consider using external authentication. So let's touch briefly on backups. Do backup as often as possible. If you do hourly backup, that can be good, but be aware that it can hurt performance. Remote backup should be a part of your strategy. Make sure that you have backups that goes away from the server. And when we are talking about remote backup, please look into the topic of immutable backup. Basically, this is backups that cannot be touched, so it gives you a better protection against ransomware attacks, where all your files, all your machinery is being locked up by hackers, and if you're not careful enough, then they also lock up your backups. So immutable backup is a way to protect yourself. All right, this was a lot in a short time. So let's recap. We talked about the basics around the FileMaker server, how it's structured under the hood. We talked about basic technologies around the server. Then we talked about installation on Mac, Windows, and Linux. Throughout the session, we touched on best practice. And finally, we talked about the SSL and security for solution and your server. and we ended with talking about backup. So thank you for watching. You are welcome to shoot me an email if you want to know more, and have a nice day.